My son texted me, "Mom, you won't be joining us. My wife insists you stay behind." The words glowed on the small screen of my phone, stark and brutal against the cheerful floral background I'd chosen ages ago. I read them once, then twice. My thumb hovered over the screen, slick with a sudden, clammy sweat, as if by swiping them away I could erase the sentiment behind them. But the message remained, a digital scar carved into the quiet afternoon. I was sitting at my dining table, the one Arthur and I bought at a flea market the first year we were married. It was solid oak, and he'd spent a whole weekend sanding and staining it to a warm honey finish. Now, it was just me at the table, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold at my elbow. The house was silent, a specific kind of silence that has its own weight and texture. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping home, it was the hollow quiet of an empty one. For 2 years, since Arthur passed, this silence had been my most constant companion. Sometimes, I'd turn on the television, letting the canned laughter from old sitcoms fill the void, but today, I hadn't bothered. The only sound was the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the frantic thumping of my own heart. The phone buzzed again, a short, sharp vibration against the polished wood. I flinched, my gaze snapping back to the screen. It was David again. A second message appeared beneath the first. "It's just complicated, Mom. Jennifer thinks it's better this way for the kids. Less disruption." Disruption. The word twisted in my gut. Was that what I was? A disruption? I, Vera, who had orchestrated every birthday party, soothed every fever, mended every scraped knee, was now a disruption. The trip had been planned for months. A week-long rental in a cabin by Lake Tahoe. It was meant to be a real family vacation, the first one since Arthur was gone. David had sold it to me as a way to make new memories, to feel like a family again. I had packed my bags 3 days ago. My small suitcase sat by the front door, a lonely sentinel waiting for a journey that would never happen. Inside was a new swimsuit I'd bought, the first in over a decade, and a stack of paperbacks I'd been saving. I'd even bought special gluten-free cookies for my granddaughter, Lily, because Jennifer was so particular about her diet. My mind, a frantic librarian, started pulling memories from dusty shelves. I saw David as a boy of 7, his face pale with chicken pox, crying for me in the middle of the night. I was there, dabbing calamine lotion on each red bump, humming lullabies until he drifted back to sleep, my own body aching with fatigue. I saw him at 16, a wreck after failing his driver's test for the second time, convinced his life was over. I was there, making him a grilled cheese sandwich, his favorite, and telling him that failure was just a stepping stone, not a destination. I saw him at 25, his voice trembling over the phone as he told me he was going to propose to Jennifer. I was there, sharing in his joy, offering the small diamond from my own mother's engagement ring to help him afford something beautiful. I had been there. Always. A constant, unwavering presence he could depend on. The North Star in his personal sky. And now, I was a disruption. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. The sound was an intrusion, an act of violence in the crushing stillness. I walked into the living room, my hand trailing along the back of Arthur's favorite armchair. The fabric was worn smooth in the places he always rested his hands and head. I could almost smell the faint, comforting scent of his Old Spice aftershave. "What would you do, Art?" I whispered into the empty air. He wouldn't have stood for this. He would have called David immediately, his voice a low rumble of disappointment, and set him straight. Arthur believed in family above all else. But Arthur was gone, and his armchair was just an armchair, filled with nothing but memories and dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. I looked at the photos on the mantelpiece. There was our wedding picture, me and Arthur, impossibly young and brimming with a naive sort of confidence. There were photos of the kids, David and his older sister, Claire, squinting into the sun on a beach somewhere, their hair bleached by the salt and summer. And there was the most recent one, from Christmas 2 years ago, the last one with Arthur. He looked thin, tired, but he was smiling, his arm wrapped tightly around my shoulders. In the photo, David and Jennifer stood slightly apart, their smiles looking a little tight, a little forced. I hadn't seen it then, so desperate to believe in the happy family facade. But I saw it now. The distance was already there. I was just the last one to notice. The sting of rejection was a physical thing, a cold bloom of pain in my chest that spread through my limbs, leaving them heavy and useless. It wasn't just about a cancelled vacation. It was about what the cancellation signified. It was a message, clearer than any text, that my role in the family had been downgraded. I was no longer a vital organ, I was an appendix, an unnecessary appendage they could remove without a second thought. I sank onto the sofa, the floral pattern of the cushions feeling suddenly garish and loud. I thought about Jennifer. She had never been warm, always maintaining a polite but distinct distance. I had tried, Lord knows I had tried. I remembered every compliment I'd given on her cooking, every time I'd offered to babysit, every carefully chosen, neutral Christmas gift. I had walked on eggshells for years, trying to earn a place in her heart, or at least in her good graces. And for what? To be dismissed via text message by my own son, who couldn't even summon the courage to call. He had outsourced his cruelty to his wife. Jennifer insists, he'd written. The words of a coward. My thoughts swirled, a bitter vortex of past and present. The promise of family time, of laughter and shared meals by the lake, had been a mirage in my emotional desert. I had been clinging to it, this 1 week, as proof that I still mattered, that I still had a place. Now, the desert stretched before me, vast and empty. I sat there for a long time, the sun creeping across the floor, the shadows lengthening, turning the familiar shapes of my furniture into monstrous silhouettes. The house grew darker, colder. I didn't get up to turn on a light. I just sat in the gathering gloom, the phone still on the table in the other room, its screen dark now. But I could still see the words, burned onto the back of my eyelids. You won't be joining us. The message wasn't just about a trip. It was a verdict. It was the closing of a door I never even knew could be shut. The silence in the house pressed in, and for the first time, it didn't feel like Arthur's absence. It felt like my own. A profound and terrifying erasure. I wrapped my arms around myself, a poor substitute for the comfort I craved. The long wait for my family to need me, to want me, was over. The answer had arrived. And as darkness finally consumed the room, a single, terrifying question began to form in my mind. If I was no longer a mother, a wife, a grandmother, who was I? My mind, in the hours that followed, became a turbulent sea of what-ifs and why-nots. I replayed the last phone call with David, searching for a clue I had missed. It had been just last Tuesday. His voice was rushed, distracted, the sound of car horns and city life buzzing in the background. Hey, Mom. Just confirming you're all set for Saturday. I'll swing by around 9. I'd assured him I was, my heart doing a little flutter of anticipation. I'd asked about the kids, about Jennifer's work. His answers were clipped, monosyllabic. Everyone's fine. Jen's busy. You know how it is. I did know. Or I thought I did. I chalked it up to the stress of modern life, the constant juggling act of career and family that I, from my quiet perch in retirement, couldn't fully comprehend. I had made excuses for his distance, papering over the cracks in our connection with the flimsy wallpaper of a mother's unconditional love. Now, his brevity felt less like busyness and more like avoidance. He hadn't wanted to talk because he already knew. The decision had likely been made days ago, discussed over dinner after their children were in bed, my name a topic on an agenda, a problem to be solved. Had they argued about it? Had David defended me, even for a moment? But she's my mother, Jen. I could almost hear it, a weak protest quickly quashed. And I'm your wife, David. We need this time for our family. Just us. I could picture Jennifer's face, her lips set in a firm, unyielding line. She was a woman who was used to getting her way. She ran their household with the same cool efficiency she applied to her job as a marketing executive. Everything had its place, every moment was scheduled, optimized. I, clearly, was an inefficiency, a variable she wished to eliminate from the equation. I got up and walked to the kitchen, my movements stiff and robotic. I opened the pantry and stared at the box of gluten-free animal crackers I'd bought for Lily. They were shaped like little bears and lions, and I'd imagined her small hands reaching into the box, her face lighting up. A ridiculous thing to get emotional over, a box of crackers, but a wave of grief washed over me so powerful it made my knees weak. I leaned against the counter, breathing deeply, trying to anchor myself in the present, in the solid feel of the cool granite beneath my palms. But the past was relentless. It pulled me back to a different kitchen, in a different house, the one where the children grew up. I remembered the endless cycle of cooking, cleaning, and caregiving. I had been the sun around which my family orbited. My own needs, my own desires, were distant, pale moons, their light extinguished by the brilliant demands of my husband and children. Arthur, bless his heart, had been a man of his time. He worked hard at the plant, came home expecting a hot meal on the table, and loved me and the kids fiercely, in his own way. But he never once asked me what I wanted to do. It was simply assumed that my want was to serve them. And I had accepted that role without question. It was what mothers did. It was what wives did. I had poured myself into them like a pitcher of water, filling their cups until my own was empty. And I had told myself I was happy. I had convinced myself that their happiness was my own. What a fool I'd been. The greatest trick I ever played was on myself. I sat back down at the dining table, the chair across from me achingly empty. This was where Arthur and I would have our coffee every morning. He'd read the sports section, I'd do the crossword puzzle, our feet sometimes touching under the table. We didn't need to talk much. After 45 years, we had our own language of silence. He would have known something was wrong just by the set of my jaw. He would have reached across the table, his hand warm and calloused, and covered mine. "What is it, Vera?" And I would have told him. He would have listened. He might not have had the perfect solution, but he would have been my ally. He would have been on my side. Now, there was no one. Claire, my daughter, lived 3 states away. We talked weekly, but our conversations were mostly superficial, a recital of recent events. She was wrapped up in her own life, her own family, her own problems. She loved me, I knew that in an abstract, intellectual way. But she wouldn't understand the depth of this wound. To her, it would be a simple disappointment, a change of plans. She wouldn't see it as the tectonic shift it was, the ground crumbling beneath my feet. The night deepened. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind a relentless projector showing a film of my life. I saw myself giving up a scholarship to a local art school to marry Arthur. I saw myself shelving my canvases and paints to make room for a nursery. I saw myself turning down a part-time job at a library, a job I had desperately wanted, because David was prone to ear infections and needed me at home. Each sacrifice had felt noble at the time, a testament to my love. Now, they felt like a series of self-inflicted wounds, a slow, methodical chipping away at my own soul. Each act of service, each concession, had been a thread in the rope they were now using to cast me adrift. I must have drifted off at some point, because I was startled awake by the first, pale light of dawn filtering through the blinds. My neck was stiff, my eyes gritty. For a fleeting second, there was peace, the blissful ignorance of a mind just waking. And then memory rushed in, and the cold knot in my stomach tightened again. The trip. The text. The truth. I was utterly, completely alone. Not just in my house, but in my life. The family I had dedicated my entire existence to building had moved on, and they had left me behind in the old structure, a ghost haunting rooms no one visited anymore. I thought of my suitcase by the door. A symbol of my misplaced hope. A monument to my own foolishness. I should move it. I should unpack it. But I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to perform that final, concrete act of acceptance. To unpack the suitcase would be to admit defeat. It would be to acknowledge that the long, patient wait for my children to see me, to value me, was finally, irrevocably over. So I left it there, a silent testament to a promise broken, and sat down at the table to watch the sun rise on the first day of the rest of my lonely life. What was I supposed to do now? The days stretched before me, a terrifying expanse of empty hours. The silence of the house seemed to mock me, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that if I didn't do something, this silence would swallow me whole. The following week was a blur of gray monotony. I went through the motions of living, but it was a pantomime. I made my bed, I washed the few dishes I used, I watched the news. But I wasn't really there. My body was in my quiet California house, but my mind was adrift, lost in a fog of hurt and confusion. The suitcase remained by the front door. Every time I passed it, it felt like a silent accusation. By Wednesday, I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed to escape the oppressive silence, the four walls that were starting to feel less like a home and more like a prison. On impulse, I grabbed my car keys and drove. I didn't have a destination in mind, I just drove, letting the familiar streets of my town spool out before me. And then I found myself turning onto Sycamore Lane, a street I hadn't visited in years. The house was at the end of the cul-de-sac. Our old house. The one where I had raised David and Claire. The new owners had painted it a trendy slate gray with a bright yellow door. My cheerful blue and white color scheme was gone. They'd torn out the rose bushes Arthur had so carefully tended and replaced them with stark, modern succulents. It looked alien, a stranger wearing my old home's bones. I parked across the street, under the shade of a large oak tree, and just stared. This house was the repository of my life's work. Within those walls, which now belonged to strangers, I had poured out the entirety of my being. I could see the ghosts of my children playing on the lawn that was no longer there. I could hear the phantom echo of the screen door slamming, followed by my own voice calling out, "Don't let the bugs in." I closed my eyes and I was back in the kitchen. Not the stranger's kitchen that was probably in there now, with stainless steel appliances and quartz countertops, but my kitchen. It was smaller, a little dated, with linoleum floors that were perpetually scuffed from roller skates and toy trucks. I could smell the phantom scent of cinnamon and yeast from the bread I used to bake every Friday. I remembered standing at that very counter, my hands covered in flour, patiently showing a 5-year-old Claire how to knead dough. Her tiny hands would push into the soft mass, giggling as it sprang back. In the corner, a 2-year-old David would be banging on a pot with a wooden spoon, our little family's chaotic symphony. That kitchen had been the heart of our home. It was where homework was done, where tears were dried, where secrets were whispered over milk and cookies. I had refereed countless sibling squabbles there, bandaged endless scraped knees, and dispensed advice on everything from playground bullies to teenage heartbreak. My mind drifted to the living room. I saw the faint water stain on the ceiling from the time David and his friend tried to create a science experiment in the upstairs bathroom. I had spent a whole weekend patching and painting that ceiling, fuming silently but never telling Arthur the full extent of the damage because I didn't want David to get in too much trouble. I saw the worn spot on the carpet in front of the television, where the kids would lie for hours watching cartoons. I'd vacuumed that spot 1,000 times, each time feeling a pang of love for the little bodies that had made it. I saw the fireplace where, every Christmas Eve, Arthur would read "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," his voice deep and soothing, while the kids, in their pajamas, grew sleepy and heavy-eyed. My entire identity had been forged in that house. I was the keeper of schedules, the healer of wounds, the chief operating officer of the family. My life had been a complex tapestry of service, woven from millions of tiny, unseen threads of sacrifice. I remembered the day Claire left for college. We had packed her car so full you could barely see out the back window. After she drove away, a tiny figure shrinking in the rearview mirror, I went back into her empty room. The silence was deafening. I sat on her bed, smoothed the comforter she had left behind, and cried. Not because I wasn't proud of her, but because a huge piece of my purpose had just driven down the street. When David left a few years later, the silence grew louder. The house felt cavernous, hollowed out. Arthur and I had rattled around in it for a few more years before deciding to downsize. We sold it to a young family, and I'd hoped they would fill it with as much love and chaos as we had. Looking at it now, so sterile and manicured, I wasn't so sure. The yellow door opened and a young woman emerged, juggling a baby on her hip and a designer diaper bag on her shoulder. She looked harried, tired. For a moment, our eyes met across the street. She gave me a brief, questioning look before turning to wrestle a car seat into the back of her SUV. I saw a flicker of my younger self in her, that bone-deep exhaustion that comes from being constantly needed. And a bitter thought surfaced: did she have any idea what she was signing up for? Did she know that one day, that baby on her hip might grow up and dismiss her with a casual text message? I hoped not. I wouldn't wish this feeling on anyone. The visit to the old house hadn't brought the comfort I'd subconsciously sought. It had done the opposite. It had thrown my sacrifices into stark, painful relief. The echoes of the past weren't warm, they were accusatory. They whispered of a life given away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for myself. I had been the scaffolding that helped my children build their lives, and once their structures were complete, the scaffolding had been dismantled and discarded, left to rust in the rain. I started the car, my hands trembling slightly. Driving away from Sycamore Lane felt different this time. It wasn't a nostalgic departure, it was a retreat. I had gone there looking for the woman I used to be, the indispensable mother, the cherished wife. Instead, I had found only ghosts. Ghosts of a life I had lived for others, and the ghost of the woman I might have become if I had ever saved a small piece of myself for me. As I turned onto the main road, leaving the slate-gray house behind, I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back had tears in her eyes, but beneath the sadness, there was something else stirring. A cold, hard flicker of anger. The house wasn't the problem. The memories weren't the problem. My children's thoughtlessness was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was my own lifelong habit of self-erasure. I had willingly made myself small, quiet, and convenient. I had taught them they could take me for granted. And I was suddenly, terrifyingly aware that I had no one to blame but myself. The drive home was a silent storm of realization. Each mile that separated me from the house on Sycamore Lane was a step closer to a devastating truth. It wasn't just David's text. It wasn't just Jennifer's coldness. It was the culmination of a lifetime of choices I had made, a pattern of behavior so deeply ingrained I hadn't even recognized it as a pattern. I had spent my entire life as a supporting actress in other people's movies. I was the wife of Arthur, the mother of David and Claire. My own name, Vera, felt like a placeholder, a role rather than an identity. My purpose had been to facilitate their dreams, to smooth their paths, to be the soft place they could land. I had done it willingly, even joyfully, believing that this service was the highest form of love. But looking back now, through the sharp, unforgiving lens of my current pain, I saw it for what it was, a slow, quiet suicide of the self. I thought about my art. In high school, I was good. My art teacher, Mrs. Gable, a woman with paint perpetually under her fingernails and a fire in her eyes, told me I had a unique eye. "You see the world differently, Vera," she'd said, holding up one of my charcoal sketches. "Don't ever let anyone dull your vision." I'd won a small scholarship to a local arts college. It wasn't much, but it was a path, a possibility. Then I met Arthur. He was handsome, steady, and utterly captivated by me. He wanted to build a life, a family. And my path, the one with easels and turpentine, seemed so solitary and uncertain compared to the warm, well-lit road he offered. So, I chose his road. I packed my paints away in a wooden box and put them in the attic of the house on Sycamore Lane. I told myself I'd get back to it one day. When the kids were older. When we had more money. When Arthur retired. When became a perpetual tomorrow that never arrived. The paints dried up in their tubes, the canvases yellowed, and the part of me that saw the world differently learned to see it in the same practical, muted tones as everyone else. The bitterness of this realization was a physical taste in my mouth, like old coffee grounds. I had not been robbed of my dreams, I had handed them over. I had been the architect of my own diminishment. I pulled into my driveway, the engine cutting out with a sigh that seemed to mimic my own. The silence of the house rushed out to meet me. I walked inside, past the still waiting suitcase, and went straight to my bookshelf. Tucked away on a bottom shelf, behind a row of gardening books, was a small, leather-bound journal. My mother had given it to me when I graduated high school. The first few pages were filled with my youthful, loopy handwriting, full of hopes and plans. I will travel to Italy and see the masters. One entry read, I will have a small studio with a big window that gets the morning light. I will never forget who I am. I slammed the book shut. The irony was too cruel. This overwhelming realization that I'd been taken for granted, that my sacrifices had been not just unappreciated but expected, was like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. It wasn't an angry, explosive feeling. It was a cold, heavy dread. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes you feel old and brittle. I thought of all the holidays I had hosted, spending weeks planning, cooking, and cleaning, only to have my children and their families arrive, eat, and leave within a few hours, leaving me with a mountain of dishes and a profound sense of anticlimax. I thought of the countless times I had dropped everything to babysit, rearranging my own plans, which they deemed less important, to suit their schedules. I was not a person with a life of her own, I was a resource. A convenience. A free, on-call service provider. The walls of my quiet little house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed to be closing in. They were papered with the ghosts of my deferred hopes. I saw the trip to the Grand Canyon Arthur and I had planned but cancelled because Claire needed money for a new transmission in her car. I saw the pottery class I'd signed up for but dropped out of because David and Jennifer needed a last-minute sitter for a work gala. Each memory was a brick in the wall of my own confinement. My children hadn't built this prison. I had. I had laid the foundation, mortared the bricks, and then handed them the key, begging them to visit. And the truth, the really ugly, unvarnished truth, was that they had moved on. They didn't need me in the same way anymore. They had their own lives, their own partners, their own support systems. My role as the central hub had become obsolete. They were no longer planets orbiting my sun, they were distant stars in their own galaxies, and I was just a fading light in their sky, something they might glance at occasionally with a vague sense of nostalgia. The love was still there, I supposed, in some diluted, habitual form. But the need, the vital, daily necessity of me, was gone. And I had so thoroughly conflated being needed with being loved that I didn't know how to exist without it. The pain of this was so immense, so all-consuming, that I had to sit down. I slumped into Arthur's armchair, the one that still held his faint scent, and I finally let myself cry. Not the quiet, dignified tears I had shed before, but great, gulping, body-racking sobs. I cried for the young girl who loved to paint, for the woman who dreamed of Italy, for the mother whose life's work had rendered her invisible. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen shut. And when the tears finally subsided, there was a terrible, echoing emptiness left in their wake. The realization was complete. I had given everything, and in return, I had been left with nothing. Not even myself. Staring out the window at my own reflection, a stranger with a tear-streaked face, I knew something had to change. The old Vera was gone, faded into nothing. The question was there enough left of me to build a new one? After a day spent marinating in the bitter stew of my own making, I knew I couldn't continue to drift in this sea of silent sorrow. The anger had cooled into a hard, clear resolve. I needed to understand. I needed to hear it. Not through the cowardly filter of a text message, but from a human voice. I wasn't ready to talk to David yet. The wound from him was too fresh, too raw. But Claire, my daughter. She had always been the more compassionate one, the diplomat in the family. Perhaps she could offer some explanation, some context that would make the world feel less like it had tilted off its axis. I picked up the phone, my hand steady for the first time in days. I dialed her number, my heart a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright and a little breathless. "Hi, Mom. Is everything okay?" The practiced cheerfulness in her tone grated on my raw nerves. "I'm not sure, Claire. That's why I'm calling," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. There was a pause. I could hear her shifting the phone, the sound of her kids playing in the background. "What's wrong? You sound strange. David sent me a text message a few days ago," I began, keeping my tone level, factual. "He told me that I wouldn't be joining them on the Tahoe trip." "He said," Jennifer insisted. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with meaning. It was a guilty silence. She knew. Of course, she knew. "Oh," she finally said, the single word laden with a discomfort she couldn't hide. "Yeah. He mentioned something about that." "He mentioned something?" I repeated, a sliver of ice in my voice. "Claire, they cancelled on me, by text, days before we were supposed to leave. This feels like more than just something." I heard her sigh, a long, weary sound. "Look, Mom, it's complicated. David is. He's caught in the middle." Jennifer has been under a lot of stress at work, and she had this idea in her head of a perfect little getaway, just the four of them. A nuclear family reset, or something. You know how she gets. I did know. Jennifer's pursuit of perfection was relentless. It left no room for messy human emotions or, apparently, mothers-in-law. "And my presence would have ruined this perfect little getaway?" I asked, the question hanging in the air between us. "No, of course not. Don't be dramatic," Claire said quickly, a little too quickly. Her defensiveness was telling. "It's just. She felt that with you there, the dynamic would shift. She said David would be focused on making sure you were comfortable, and she wanted him to be focused on her and the kids. She feels like she doesn't get enough of his attention as it is." The words were meant to be placating, an explanation. But what I heard was a confirmation of my worst fears. I wasn't a beloved family member. I was a duty. A responsibility that distracted my son from his real family. "So I'm a burden," I stated, the words tasting like ash. "A chore he has to manage." "That's not what I'm saying." Claire's voice rose in frustration. "I'm just trying to explain Jennifer's perspective. It's not personal, Mom. Her priorities are just different now. Her world is about her husband and her kids. That's her focus." "And where am I in that world, Claire?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Where do I fit in? Am I just a holiday obligation? A birthday card in the mail? Someone you call once a week out of a sense of duty?" The line went quiet again. I could hear her struggling for the right words, the kind words that would smooth this over, that would put me back in my box, content and uncomplaining. But there were no right words. The truth was laid bare between us. "Mom," she said finally, her voice softer now, tinged with a pity that was almost worse than the rejection itself. "Things change. We're all grown up. We have our own families. It's not like it was when we were kids living at home. Life. It just moves on." "Life moves on." She said it as if it were a simple, unavoidable fact of nature, like tides or seasons. And perhaps it was. But she was on the boat, sailing forward, and she didn't seem to notice that I was standing on the shore, watching her disappear over the horizon. Her words, though spoken with a gentle kindness, were a final, brutal confirmation. My children loved me, yes, in the way one loves a cherished memory or a distant landmark from their childhood. But they no longer needed me. My role as the center of their universe had expired. I was no longer the sun. I was a distant planet, cold and orbiting nothing, my purpose extinguished. "I see," I said. And I did. I saw with a clarity that was both terrifying and, in a strange way, liberating. The fog of hope and denial I had been living in for years had finally burned away. The truth, in all its harsh, painful glory, was right in front of me. I was alone. My children had their own lives, and I was not at the center of them. I wasn't even in the inner circle. I was a satellite, kept in a distant, predictable orbit by the weak gravitational pull of memory and obligation. "Mom? Are you still there?" Claire's voice was laced with concern now. She had delivered the blow, and now she was worried about the damage. "I'm here," I said. "Thank you for your honesty, Claire. It's helpful." It was helpful. It was the coldest, most painful shower I had ever taken, but it had woken me up. It had washed away the last vestiges of my self-delusion. "I have to go," I said, not waiting for her response. "Goodbye, Claire." I ended the call before she could offer any more useless platitudes. I set the phone down on the counter, my hand perfectly steady. The conversation hadn't healed me, but it had cauterized the wound. It had burned away the ambiguity, the hope that I was just misinterpreting things. I wasn't. The reality of my situation was exactly as I feared. I walked into the living room and stood before the mantelpiece, looking at the family photos. The smiling faces seemed to mock me. They were images of a life that no longer existed, a role I no longer played. With a sudden, decisive movement, I picked up the most recent Christmas photo, the one with me and Arthur and the kids. I looked at my own face in the picture, my smile bright, my eyes full of a hope that now seemed painfully naive. Then, I turned the frame over, opened the back, and slid the photo out. I walked into the kitchen, tore the glossy image of our happy family into 4 neat pieces, and dropped them into the trash can. It was a small, symbolic act, but it felt monumental. It was the first step, the first crack in the foundation of the prison I had built for myself. I was no longer the center of their world. The realization was a bitter pill, but I had swallowed it. And now, for the first time, I had to confront the terrifying question of what it meant to be the center of my own. The days following my conversation with Claire were the quietest yet. The initial shock had subsided, the anger had cooled, and what was left was a vast, desolate landscape of loneliness. The silence in the house took on a new character. It was no longer a temporary state waiting to be broken by a phone call or a visit, it felt permanent, structural. It was the new sound of my life. My daily routines, once a source of comfort, now felt like a hollow ritual. I would wake up, make coffee for one, and sit at the dining table, staring at the empty chair across from me. Arthur's chair. Before, it had been a symbol of loving memory. Now, it was a stark reminder of all I had lost. Not just him, but the entire life that had been built around our partnership. The phone, which I had once watched with hopeful anticipation, now sat silent on the counter. David didn't call. I assumed Claire had reported back on our conversation, and he was likely relieved to be let off the hook, happy to let the awkward situation fade away. Claire sent a text a couple of days later, "Thinking of you, Mom. Hope you're okay." Red heart emoji. The heart emoji felt like an insult, a tiny, digital pat on the head. I didn't respond. What was there to say? "No, I'm not okay. Your casual dismissal of my life's purpose has sent me into an existential crisis." It seemed a bit much for a text message. My isolation felt complete. I'd watch my neighbors, the Winstons, from my kitchen window. They were my age, and their lives seemed so full. Their grown children visited on weekends, their cars filling the driveway. I'd see them out in the yard, laughing, playing with their grandchildren. Each peal of laughter that drifted across the lawn was like a small stone thrown at the fragile glass of my composure. It wasn't envy, not exactly. It was a profound sense of otherness, of having taken a wrong turn somewhere long ago and ending up in a different country, where I no longer spoke the language. Even my old social connections felt frayed and distant. I had been a regular at my church's Wednesday morning coffee group. I'd missed the last 2 weeks, and no one had called to check on me. I realized with a pang that my presence there was likely as peripheral as it was in my own family. I was just Vera, Arthur's widow, a quiet woman who mostly listened. I hadn't forged deep, individual friendships. My social life had been an extension of my role as a wife. Now that Arthur was gone, I was untethered, floating away from the group without anyone really noticing. I tried to read, but the words on the page wouldn't cohere. They were just black marks on a white background. My mind would drift, replaying conversations, dissecting tones, searching for the exact moment when I had become invisible. One afternoon, desperate for a change of scenery, I drove to the local library. I used to love the library, the hushed reverence for stories, the smell of old paper and binding glue. But as I walked through the aisles, I felt a deep melancholy. All these books, all these lives, all these adventures. And I was living none of them. I saw a flyer on a community bulletin board for a beginner's watercolor class. I paused, my fingers tracing the edge of the paper. A ghost of my former self, the girl with the art scholarship, whispered in my ear. But the voice of the present was louder, more cynical. "What's the point?" it sneered. "Who would you show your paintings to?" I turned and walked away, the weight of my own purposelessness pressing down on me. The loneliness was a physical presence, a cold fog that seeped into every corner of my house and my heart. My world had shrunk to the size of these four walls. My days became shapeless, distinguished only by the rising and setting of the sun. I would find myself standing in the middle of a room, unsure of how I got there or what I was supposed to be doing. The phone calls from my children, when they finally came, were strained and awkward. Claire called the following Sunday, her voice laced with a forced brightness. She talked about the kids' soccer games and a project at work. She didn't mention our last conversation. It was a carefully choreographed dance around the truth, and we were both clumsy partners. David called a few days after that, presumably prodded by his sister. He was on his way home from the Tahoe trip. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice hesitant. "We had a good time. The kids loved the lake." "That's nice," I said, my voice a monotone. "Sorry again about how that all went down," he mumbled, the apology sounding rote and obligatory. It was just bad timing. I didn't have the energy to argue, to tell him that his bad timing had dismantled my sense of self-worth. "It's fine, David," I lied. "I hope you all had a wonderful time." It was easier to lie. It was easier to be the uncomplaining mother he expected me to be. The conversation was short. He promised they'd come by for a visit soon, a vague, empty promise that neither of us believed. After I hung up, the silence that flooded the room was heavier than ever. The brief contact hadn't alleviated my loneliness, it had amplified it. It had highlighted the vast emotional distance between us. They were living their lives, full of lake trips and soccer games, and I was a footnote, an afterthought. That evening, I sat in Arthur's chair, watching the twilight bleed the color from the sky. A profound sorrow settled over me, deeper than any I had felt before. It wasn't just about being left out of a vacation. It was the crushing realization that the life I had so carefully constructed had been built on sand. The tide had come in, and it had all washed away, leaving me stranded. I had given my all to a family that no longer required my all, and in the process, I had forgotten to keep anything for myself. The isolation was no longer just a feeling, it was a fact. I was an island. And as darkness fell, I feared I would be an island forever, adrift in a silent, lonely sea. For another week, I drifted. The fog of loneliness was thick, and I saw no way out. I was trapped in a feedback loop of memory and regret. Then, on a Tuesday morning that felt exactly like all the other mornings, the mail arrived. Bills, junk mail, and a postcard. The front was a picture of the dusty, sun-baked landscape of Sedona, Arizona. I flipped it over. The handwriting was elegant, familiar, but I couldn't place it at first. "Vera," it read. "Heard you were still in the old neighborhood. I've moved back to be closer to my daughter after my husband passed. Let's not be strangers for another 30 years. Call me. Florence." Florence Miller. She had lived 2 doors down from us on Sycamore Lane. She was a whirlwind of a woman, with a loud laugh and a penchant for brightly colored scarves. We hadn't been close friends, more like friendly acquaintances brought together by proximity and children of a similar age. They had moved away when her husband was transferred for work, sometime when our kids were in middle school. I stared at the postcard, a flicker of something, not quite hope, but curiosity, stirring within me. I hadn't spoken to Florence in decades. How did she even know I was here? Probably from the neighborhood grapevine, which I knew was still active. I put the postcard on the kitchen counter and stared at it for the rest of the day. The thought of calling a near stranger was intimidating. What would we even talk about? But the postcard itself was a small light in my gray world. It was a message from someone who wasn't a child, someone who had sought me out not from obligation, but from choice. The next day, after 2 cups of coffee for courage, I dialed the number she'd written. A voice boomed on the other end, as loud and full of life as I remembered. Florence Miller speaking. Florence? It's Vera. Vera Thompson. Vera. I'm so glad you called. She exclaimed, and she sounded genuinely happy, not the polite, forced happiness I'd grown used to. I was hoping you would. How the devil are you? The question was so direct, so lacking in pretense, that it caught me off guard. Without thinking, I found myself telling her the truth. Maybe not the whole truth, but a part of it. I've been better, Florence. A little at sea, if I'm being honest. At sea, she repeated, her voice softening with an empathy that felt real. I know that feeling. After Bill died, I felt like my boat had lost its rudder, its anchor, and its sails all at once. Tell me, Vera, what's got you adrift? And so I told her. I told her about the cancelled trip, the text message, the feeling of being left behind. I didn't cry. My voice was steady, almost clinical, as I recounted the events. When I finished, she didn't offer pity or platitudes. She just said, well, that's a rotten thing for them to do. Children can be terribly selfish, can't they? They get so wrapped up in their own little worlds they forget we have worlds of our own. Her validation was like a bomb on a burn. She understood. She wasn't making excuses for them. The question is, she continued, her voice brisk again, what are you going to do about it? You can't just sit in that house and wait for them to remember you exist. You'll turn to dust. Her words were blunt, but they were exactly what I needed to hear. I don't know what to do, I confessed, my voice small. Then you'll have to try some things, she said matter-of-factly. What did you used to love to do, Vera? Before you were a wife and a mother. What did you love? The question hit me like a punch. I thought of the dusty box of paints, the girl who dreamed of a studio. I used to paint, I stammered. Paint? She boomed. Wonderful. Do you still? No. Not for 40 years, maybe. Nonsense. It's like riding a bicycle. Listen, there's a little art supply shop downtown. I'm going there tomorrow to pick up some yarn for my new knitting obsession. Meet me there. 11 o'clock. We'll get you some paints. It's not a request, it's an order. And she hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, stunned. I was terrified. But I was also intrigued. The next morning, I almost backed out a dozen times. But Florence's no-nonsense voice echoed in my head. At 10:50, I found myself pulling into a parking spot downtown. Florence was waiting for me out front, a vision in a turquoise tunic and a bright orange scarf. She enveloped me in a hug that smelled faintly of lavender and sheer force of will. Inside the store, I was overwhelmed. The colors, the textures, the possibilities. Florence strode through the aisles like a general, grabbing a set of watercolor tubes, a pad of thick paper, a few brushes. "This'll get you started," she announced, dumping them into a basket. "Don't think about it, just do it. Make a mess. Paint something ugly. It doesn't matter. The point is to make something that is yours and yours alone." That afternoon, I sat at my dining table, the one that had been a stage for so much sadness, and I squeezed a dollop of cerulean blue onto a cheap plastic palette. I dipped the brush in water, then into the paint, and touched it to the paper. The color exploded, a vibrant, living thing. It was clumsy. I had no idea what I was doing. But Florence's words came back to me, "Make something that is yours." I painted a blue splotch. Then a yellow one. I watched them bleed together, creating a surprising, beautiful green. I wasn't painting a landscape or a portrait. I was just playing with color. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a small, genuine smile touched my lips. I wasn't waiting for a phone call. I wasn't replaying hurtful conversations. I was here, in this moment, creating something. It wasn't a masterpiece. It wasn't for anyone else. It was just for me. The fog in my head began to thin, just a little. The glimmer of hope Florence had ignited with her postcard was no longer just a glimmer. It was a tiny, fragile flame, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that it was my job, and my job alone, to protect it and help it grow. The small act of buying paints cracked open a door I thought was sealed shut forever. For the next few weeks, my dining table was a chaotic landscape of paper, palettes, and jars of murky water. Most of what I painted was dreadful. Muddy colors, awkward shapes. But it didn't matter. The process itself was a revelation. It was an activity with no purpose other than its own execution. It wasn't for my husband, my children, or my home. It was purely, selfishly for me. And it was intoxicating. Florence became my lifeline. We met for coffee once a week, and her pragmatic, life-affirming energy was infectious. She dragged me to a local book club, held in the back room of the library I had fled from weeks earlier. I was nervous at first, sitting amongst a circle of strangers, but as they discussed the novel, I found myself chiming in, offering an opinion. And people listened. They nodded. They valued my perspective. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. I was a person with thoughts worth hearing. This burgeoning sense of self, this tiny sprout of independence, was a tender new growth. I was protective of it. So when David called a month after the Tahoe trip, his voice oozing a manufactured charm, I felt a new kind of strength rise in me. "Hey Mom," he said. "Jennifer and I were thinking of coming over for dinner on Sunday. We thought we'd bring the kids, let them see Grandma." In the past, I would have been overjoyed. I would have spent 2 days cleaning and cooking, my heart full of gratitude for this crumb of attention. But the new Vera paused. She thought about her Sunday. She had planned to spend the afternoon painting. The light was best in the afternoon. "I'm sorry, David, but this Sunday doesn't work for me," I said, my voice calm and even. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I had never, in his entire life, told him I was unavailable. "Oh," he said, confused. "You have plans?" "Yes," I said simply. I didn't elaborate. I didn't feel the need to justify my time to him. My time was mine. "Oh. Okay. Well, what about next weekend?" he asked, a hint of irritation in his tone. This wasn't going according to his script. "Let me check my calendar and get back to you, David," I said. "I'll call you later in the week." I ended the call, my heart pounding. It was a small rebellion, but it felt like a revolution. I had said no. I had prioritized my own simple plan, to paint, over his command performance. The confrontation I had been dreading came a few days later. He called back, his tone more businesslike. He and Jennifer needed to talk to me about something important. They wanted to come over that evening. I agreed, a cold knot of apprehension forming in my stomach. When they arrived, they sat on my sofa, looking serious. Jennifer did most of the talking, as usual. She explained that they were looking to buy a bigger house in a better school district. They had found the perfect place, but the down payment was steep. "We were hoping," she said, getting to the point, "that you might consider helping us out. Perhaps by taking out a line of credit on this house. Your equity is just sitting here, not doing anything." I stared at her. The audacity of it was breathtaking. After dismissing me, excluding me, and treating me like an inconvenience, they were now here, asking me to leverage my home, my only real asset, for their benefit. The old Vera would have been flustered, eager to please, probably agreeing before she even had time to think. She would have seen it as another way to prove her love, to make herself necessary. But the old Vera was gone. I looked at my son, who was steadfastly avoiding my gaze, staring at a spot on the carpet. "No, I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a thunderclap. Jennifer's eyes widened. No? She repeated, as if she'd never heard the word before. David, I said, turning my full attention to my son, forcing him to look at me. The answer is no. But Mom, he started, his voice a whine I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. It would help us so much. This is for the kids. I have helped you, I said, my voice gaining strength. I helped you with the down payment on your first house. I have babysat for free for years, saving you thousands of dollars. I have given you my time, my energy, my life. And what I have learned recently is that my support is taken for granted. My presence is considered a disruption. I let the word hang in the air. David flinched. That text message you sent me, David, was not just about a vacation. It was a message about my value to you. Or lack thereof. You and your wife have made it very clear that I am not a central part of your family. I am an outsider, an obligation. And I will not finance the lives of people who treat me that way. This house, I said, gesturing around the room, is mine. It's my security. It's what Arthur and I worked our whole lives for. And its equity is not just sitting here. It is protecting my future. A future that, I have recently discovered, I am solely responsible for. Jennifer was speechless, her mouth slightly agape. David looked pale. He finally seemed to understand that a fundamental shift had occurred. Mom, I'm sorry, he stammered. I know that text was wrong. I was a coward. I let Jen pressure me, and I hurt you. I'm truly sorry. It was the first sincere apology I had heard from him. It touched a part of me, the mother part that would always love him. But it didn't change my mind. I hear your apology, David. And I appreciate it, I said. But my decision stands. My financial support is no longer on the table. My relationship with you, with all of you, is going to have to be rebuilt on something other than what I can do for you or what I can give you. It will have to be built on mutual respect. And respect is something you earn. I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. They left in a state of stunned silence. After the door closed behind them, I didn't feel triumphant or angry. I felt calm. Grounded. I had stood up for myself. I had protected myself. I had drawn a line in the sand, not out of spite, but out of a newfound sense of self-worth. I had taken back my independence, a piece at a time. First with a paintbrush, then with a word. I walked over to my painting table. The afternoon light was streaming through the window, just right. I picked up a brush, squeezed a brilliant cadmium yellow onto my palette, and I began to paint. I was painting a sunrise. And for the first time, it felt like my own. The confrontation with David and Jennifer was a turning point. It was as if I had finally spoken a foreign language they could understand, the language of no. The immediate aftermath was a deafening silence. For 2 weeks, I heard from neither of them. Part of me, the old, conditioned part, felt a pang of anxiety. Had I gone too far? Had I severed the cord completely? But another, stronger part of me felt a quiet calm. I had spoken my truth. The ball was now in their court. I filled the silence with my new life. I painted every day, losing myself in color and form. I attended my book club and discovered I had opinions, strong ones, about literature. I started going for long walks with Florence, exploring parts of our town I'd never seen. We'd talk about everything and nothing, our pasts, our children, our fears, our ridiculous new knitting projects. It was a friendship built not on shared history or obligation, but on present-day connection. It was nourishing in a way I hadn't realized I was starved for. Then, one Saturday afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was Claire. She stood on my doorstep, alone, looking nervous. "Can I come in?" she asked. "Of course," I said, leading her to the living room. She didn't sit on the sofa but chose the armchair opposite mine. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on the dining table, which was covered in my painting supplies. "You're painting again," she said, a note of surprise in her voice. "Yes," I said. "It makes me happy." She nodded, absorbing this. "David told me what happened," she began, her voice soft. "About them asking for money. And about what you said." I waited, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I would not make this easy for her. I would not fill the silence. "Mom," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. "I am so sorry. When we talked on the phone, I was awful. I was dismissive. I tried to smooth things over, to manage your feelings, instead of just listening. Instead of seeing how hurt you were." Her tears were genuine, and they moved me. "I heard what you said to David about respect. And I realized. I haven't been respectful. I've treated you like a given. Like a permanent fixture in the background of my life that would always be there, no matter what. I took you for granted. And I am so ashamed." She was crying freely now, and my maternal instinct to rush over and comfort her was overwhelming. But I stayed put. This was something she needed to say, and something I needed to hear, without me rushing in to fix it. "I miss Dad," she whispered through her tears. "And I think, after he was gone, I just expected you to continue being Mom. The constant. The rock. I never stopped to think about what you were going through. I never asked what you needed. I am so sorry." This was it. This was the conversation I had longed to have. Not an argument, not a defense, but a true, heartfelt acknowledgement. "Thank you for saying that, Claire," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "It means a lot to hear it." We sat in a comfortable silence for a few moments. "I want to do better," she said finally, wiping her eyes. "I want a real relationship with you, Mom. Not one based on duty or holidays. I want to know the person who paints and joins book clubs. I want you in my life, not as a background fixture, but as you." Her visit was the first stone in rebuilding a bridge. A few weeks later, David came by, alone. He was humbled, contrite. He apologized again, more thoroughly this time, for the text, for the entitlement, for his cowardice in letting Jennifer be his mouthpiece. He admitted that my refusal to give them the money had been a shock, but that it had forced him to look at his own behavior. "I've been acting like a spoiled kid," he said, looking me in the eye. "I just assumed you'd always be there to bail me out, to fix things. I never stopped to think about what it cost you." Our conversation was stiff, awkward, but it was honest. It was a start. The relationships began to change, slowly, tentatively. The visits were different. Claire started calling just to chat, to ask about my painting or what book I was reading. She brought the grandkids over one afternoon, not to drop them off, but with the stated purpose of a real visit with Grandma. We didn't do anything special. We baked cookies, and I showed my granddaughter, Lily, how to paint a watercolor flower. The look of delight on her face as the colors blended was a pure, uncomplicated joy. David and Jennifer kept their distance for a while, which I was grateful for. The financial request had created a necessary boundary. But even their communication changed. He would send pictures of the kids, with no request attached. "Just thought you'd like to see this." It was a small gesture, but it was a shift. They were learning to relate to me not as a resource, but as a person. The biggest change, however, was within me. I no longer waited by the phone. My happiness was no longer contingent on their attention. My days were full. I joined a beginner's yoga class with Florence. I started volunteering at the local animal shelter, walking dogs who were as happy to see me as I was to see them. I was building a life that was mine, on my own terms. My relationship with my children was becoming an addition to my life, not the entirety of it. They were learning to fit into my world, instead of demanding I exist only in the margins of theirs. The path forward wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, reminders of old patterns. But it was a new path, and we were walking it together, albeit with a new map. One where my home, my time, and my heart were no longer uncharted territory for them to claim, but a sovereign nation, of which I, finally, was the queen. The seasons have turned a few times since the day that text message arrived. My little house, once a monument to loneliness, is now a vibrant, cluttered studio. Canvases lean against walls, Jars of brushes sit next to the coffee maker, and the dining table is permanently splattered with a rainbow of watercolor stains. It is a happy mess. It is my mess. I sit here now, in Arthur's armchair, which I now think of as my armchair, sipping my morning tea. The light streams in through the window, catching the dust motes as they dance. The silence is no longer hollow or oppressive, it is peaceful. It is the sound of contentment. My life, which I once thought was over, has turned out to be a story with a surprise second act. My journey back to myself was not a straight line. It was a messy, meandering path, full of switchbacks and stumbles. There were days of profound sadness, moments where the old loneliness would creep back in, a familiar ghost at my door. But I learned to greet it, acknowledge it, and then gently show it the way out. I learned that my value is not determined by my utility to others. It is inherent. It is the simple, profound fact of my own existence. My relationship with my children continues to evolve. It is not the relationship I once thought I wanted, the one where I was the indispensable center of their universe. It is something better. It is something realer. It is a relationship between adults, built on a new foundation of respect and healthy boundaries. Claire calls me every week, and our conversations are rich and genuine. We talk about our lives, our hopes, our fears. I am no longer just mom, I am her friend, her confidant. David and I are still finding our way. The wound he inflicted was deep, and it has left a scar. But we are talking. He brings the children to visit, and he is learning to see me as a person with her own life, her own interests. He recently framed one of my simple watercolor paintings of a seascape and hung it in his office. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Jennifer remains distant, but politely so. I have come to accept that we will never be close, and I am at peace with that. I no longer need everyone's approval. I have my own. Florence remains my steadfast co-conspirator in this new adventure of aging. We have our weekly coffees, our book club, our yoga classes where we both groan and laugh at our own inflexibility. We are planning a trip. A real one. A week-long painting retreat in New Mexico. I have a suitcase by the door again, but this time, it is packed with my own hopes, for a journey I have chosen. I have learned that self-love is not selfish. It is the essential act of survival. It is the slow, patient work of reclaiming the pieces of yourself you gave away. It is choosing to be the main character in your own story, not a footnote in someone else's. I look at my reflection in the window pane. I see an old woman. Her face is lined with the map of her years, her hair is the color of silver. But her eyes are not sad. They are not empty. They are clear, and they are bright. They are the eyes of a woman who has walked through the fire and come out the other side, not unscathed, but whole. She has rediscovered the most important relationship of all, the one with herself. The sun is beginning to set, painting the sky in strokes of brilliant orange and deep violet. It is beautiful, and I am here to see it. I am finally, peacefully, gratefully, here.